What if a family could disappear in the middle of an ordinary night? Not during a storm, not after a public argument, not during a known crisis. Just vanish. No signs of a struggle, no forced entry, no goodbye note, no explanation. And for years, no bodies. In the early days of February 2010, a family of four living in this quiet neighborhood simply stopped existing. No one heard screams. No neighbors reported anything unusual. The house stood untouched, as if time itself had frozen inside. Investigators would later say this was one of the most puzzling disappearances in California history, because when the McStay family vanished, nothing about the scene made sense. The front door was locked. The windows were intact. The furniture was in place. Inside, bowls of popcorn sat out, unfinished. Food remained in the kitchen. Personal belongings were left behind. And yet, an entire family was gone. Who leaves their home so suddenly and never comes back? February 2010. This was not supposed to be a moment that would define a mystery. There was no emergency call, no frantic report, no immediate panic. At first, it was just silence. Phone calls went unanswered. Text messages were never read. Days passed. Then concern turned into fear. When relatives finally entered the McStay home in Fallbrook, what they found was unsettling, not because it looked violent, but because it looked too normal. Life appeared to have been interrupted mid-motion. The family dog was alive, wandering the property, as if waiting for someone who never returned. The McStays hadn't packed. They hadn't withdrawn large sums of money. They hadn't told anyone they were leaving. And yet, they were gone. Joseph McStay was a husband, a father, and an entrepreneur. He was intelligent, driven, and deeply focused on building a future for his family. He worked as a software developer and ran a small business manufacturing decorative water fountains, a niche operation, but one he believed could grow. His wife, Summer McStay, was the heart of the household. A devoted mother, she spent most of her time caring for their two young sons. Johnny, just 4 years old, was energetic and curious. Joseph Jr., only 3, was still learning to speak in full sentences. These were children who depended entirely on the adults around them. Children who could not simply disappear on their own. The McStays were not wealthy. They were not famous. They weren't involved in crime. They were an ordinary family with ordinary routines. And that is what makes this story so unsettling, because families like this are not supposed to vanish without a trace. Fallbrook, California, a semi-rural community north of San Diego. It's known for its calm atmosphere, open land, and tight-knit neighborhoods. Violent crime here is rare. Neighbors know one another. Suspicion travels quickly. This is not the kind of place where an entire family disappears unnoticed. And yet, in this peaceful setting, the McStay home became the starting point of a mystery that would stretch on for years. No crime scene tape, no bloodstains, no shattered glass, just absence. When police began looking into the disappearance, one theory quickly rose to the surface. What if the McStays left voluntarily? Days after the disappearance, the family's vehicle, an Isuzu Trooper SUV, was found abandoned near the U.S. Mexico border. The location fueled speculation. Did the family cross into Mexico to start over? Were they escaping financial trouble? Did they want to disappear? Border surveillance footage even appeared to show a family of four crossing on foot. At the time, investigators believed the case might not be criminal at all. But something about that explanation never fully sat right. Summer didn't have a passport. The children had no travel documents. And the family left behind money, phones, and personal items. If they left willingly, why leave everything behind? Weeks passed, then months. No confirmed sightings. No phone activity. No contact with friends or family. The McStay family, for people, had vanished into silence. And slowly, public attention faded. For years, there were no arrests, no confirmed crime, no answers, until one question began to surface, quietly, then loudly. What if this was never a disappearance at all? What if it was something far worse? As investigators looked deeper into Joseph McStay's life, one area stood out: his business. Joseph worked closely with a man named Charles Chase Merritt. Merritt was not a stranger. He wasn't a passerby. He was a trusted business associate, someone who knew Joseph's finances, schedule, and daily routines. At the time of the disappearance, Merritt was not considered a suspect. He remained in the background, waiting. For nearly 4 years, The McStay family remained missing, their fate unknown, their story unfinished. No crime scene, no confessions, no proof, just a quiet house and a family that never came home. But in the vast emptiness of the California desert, something lay hidden, something that would eventually force investigators to confront a horrifying truth. Because the McStay family didn't disappear. They were taken, and what happened next would change everything.
What if the most important clues in a murder weren't screams or blood, but time itself? A few hours, a handful of ordinary moments, and a silence that followed. Because in the McStay family case, everything hinges on what happened and what didn't during one quiet February night. February 4th, 2010. This is the last confirmed day the McStay family is seen alive. Joseph McStay and his wife Summer go about their day as usual. Surveillance footage later captures them running errands, routine stops, nothing hurried, nothing suspicious. No arguments, no visible distress, no indication that this would be the final day of their lives. They return home to their house in Fallbrook, a place of routine, familiarity, and safety. That evening, neighbors notice nothing unusual. No raised voices, no sounds of a struggle, no emergency calls. The night passes quietly, and somewhere between nightfall and the following morning, the McStay family disappears. By the next day, something is wrong, though no one realizes it yet. Joseph doesn't answer calls. Summer doesn't respond to messages. There is no online activity, no emails, no texts. At first, this isn't alarming. Families get busy, phones get missed, but the silence stretches. Hours turn into days, and the absence begins to feel heavy. As the days pass, relatives grow uneasy. The McStays are not known to disappear without explanation. They are especially protective of their children. Friends expect updates, photos, check-ins. None come. Then there's the dog. Neighbors notice the family dog wandering the property, alive, fed, but clearly unattended. That detail becomes one of the earliest signs that something is deeply wrong. Families don't leave pets behind if they plan to return, and they certainly don't abandon them without arranging care. Still, there is no official missing persons report. Not yet. On February 13th, 9 days after the last confirmed sighting, Joseph's brother Michael McStay enters the Fallbrook home. What he finds is disturbing, not because it looks violent, but because it doesn't. The house is tidy. Furniture is undisturbed. No drawers are overturned. No signs of forced entry. In the kitchen, bowls of popcorn sit out, half-eaten. Food remains on the counter. It looks as though the family simply stood up and walked away. Bedrooms show no indication of packing. Clothing is still there. Personal belongings remain untouched. The children's things are still inside. This is not how a family leaves voluntarily. And yet, there is no evidence of a crime. Police examine the home. No blood, no weapons, no visible signs of a struggle. There is nothing that legally qualifies the house as a crime scene. Without evidence of foul play, investigators are forced to consider other possibilities. One theory rises quickly to the top. Days later, a major discovery shifts the direction of the case. The McStay family's Isuzu Trooper SUV is found abandoned near the San Isidro border crossing, close to the U.S. Mexico border. The vehicle is not damaged. There is no blood inside. No personal items clearly indicate violence. The location sparks immediate speculation. Did the family cross into Mexico? Did they leave the country intentionally? Investigators review border surveillance footage from the area. What they see appears to show a family of 4 crossing on foot into Mexico. 2 adults, 2 small children. For a moment, it seems like the mystery might already be solved. Authorities begin leaning toward a voluntary disappearance. Perhaps the McStays were under financial stress. Perhaps they wanted a fresh start. Perhaps they were escaping something. The absence of blood or forced entry supports this idea. And for a time, the case is treated less like a crime and more like a missing family who chose to vanish. But cracks quickly appear in that theory. Summer McStay did not have a passport. The children had no travel documents. Money was left behind. And no one, not family, not friends, had heard even a whisper of plans to leave the country. If this was a planned departure, it was one that left behind too many unanswered questions. Weeks pass, then months. No confirmed sightings. No bank activity. No communication. The border footage remains inconclusive, grainy, distant, and impossible to confirm with certainty. Despite lingering doubts, the lack of physical evidence stalls the investigation. No bodies, no crime scene, no proof, and slowly, the case goes cold. The McStay family fades from headlines. But time, as investigators would later realize, was not erasing the truth. It was hiding it. If the McStays didn't leave voluntarily, if they didn't cross the border, then what really happened between the night of February 4 and the morning of February 5th? Who last saw them alive? Who had access to their home? Who benefited from their disappearance? The answers to those questions were not in the house. They were not at the border. They were buried somewhere far from Fallbrook, waiting to be found. But for now, the clock kept ticking, and the truth remained hidden. What if the biggest mistake in this case wasn't what investigators missed, but what they assumed? What if, from the very beginning, the McStay family wasn't missing at all, but already gone? Because while one theory told police the family had chosen to disappear, those closest to them were certain of one thing: something was very wrong. From the earliest days of the disappearance, Joseph McStay's family pushed back against the idea of a voluntary escape. They knew Joseph, they knew Summer, and they knew their children. Summer did not have a passport. The boys were too young to travel unnoticed, and neither parent had ever spoken of abandoning their life, their families, or their responsibilities. Phones were left behind. Money remained untouched. Personal items were still in the home. To Joseph's relatives, the idea that the McStays simply walked away felt impossible. But without physical evidence of a crime, investigators were limited. And for years, the case drifted, suspended between doubt and denial. As time passed with no sign of the family, detectives began re-examining Joseph McStay's life, not just his home, but his work. Joseph ran a small manufacturing business called Earth-Inspired Products. The company specialized in decorative water fountains and custom designs. It wasn't a massive operation, but it involved money, contracts, and trust. And within that business circle was a man who knew Joseph well. His name was Charles Chase Merritt. Chase Merritt was not a stranger to the McStay family. He was a close business associate. He worked with Joseph regularly. He had access to company finances and accounts. Merritt wasn't just involved, he was embedded. At the time of the disappearance, Merritt was one of the last known people to have contact with Joseph. Still, in the early years, he was not a suspect. Not officially, but as investigators began quietly reviewing financial records, troubling patterns emerged. Bank statements told a story that Joseph's empty house could not. Investigators later uncovered evidence that large sums of money had gone missing from Earth-Inspired Products. Checks appeared to have been forged. Funds were transferred without Joseph's authorization. And financial disputes between Joseph and Merritt were escalating. In the weeks leading up to the disappearance, Joseph had reportedly confronted Merritt about money, questioning transactions that didn't make sense. For investigators, this raised a critical question. If Joseph was about to expose financial misconduct, who stood to lose the most? Even as the case stalled publicly, it never fully went away. Joseph's family continued pressing for answers. Media interest flared, then faded. Tips came in, none leading to the McStays. Years passed. Then, in November 2013, nearly 4 years after the family vanished, the silence was finally broken. Not by a confession, not by a witness, but by chance. In the remote stretches of the Mojave Desert, near Victorville, California, a motorcyclist riding through the area noticed something unusual in the terrain. A shallow depression, disturbed ground. Authorities were called. What they found would change everything. Beneath the desert surface were human remains, buried in shallow graves, far from Fallbrook, far from the McStay home. Forensic teams began a slow, careful process of recovery and identification. The results were devastating. The remains were identified as belonging to Joseph McStay, Summer McStay, Johnny McStay, Joseph McStay Jr. The missing family had been found, and with that discovery, the voluntary disappearance theory collapsed completely. Forensic analysis determined the family had been killed, not lost, not missing, but murdered. Investigators concluded the cause of death was blunt force trauma. Buried alongside the remains was a sledgehammer, a grim piece of evidence that pointed directly to homicide. The McStay family had not crossed the border. They had been taken and buried in the desert. With the discovery of the bodies, The case was no longer a mystery of absence. It was now a murder investigation. Every assumption made in the early years was re examined. Every person close to Joseph was scrutinized again: financial records, phone data, business relationships. And at the center of it all, one name resurfaced, louder than before: Chase Merritt. The discovery in the desert gave investigators what they had lacked for years: proof of foul play, a timeline to rebuild, and a reason to pursue answers without restraint. What once looked like a family choosing to disappear now appeared to be something far darker: a calculated act hidden behind normalcy and time. The investigation was no longer asking where the McStays went. It was asking who did this and why. And the evidence was beginning to point in one direction. Because someone knew Joseph McStay well enough to get close. Someone trusted enough to avoid suspicion. And someone with everything to lose.
What if the person responsible for the McStay family's disappearance wasn't a stranger hiding in the shadows, but someone who sat across the table, shook hands, and talked business? Someone trusted, someone invited in. Because as investigators rebuilt the case from the ground up, one name rose above all others. Not suddenly, but inevitably: Charles Chase Merritt. Chase Merritt wasn't just connected to Joseph McStay. He was woven into Joseph's professional life. Merritt worked closely with Joseph at Earth-inspired products, the decorative fountain business Joseph had built from the ground up. Merritt handled technical work, finances, and day-to-day operations. He knew the company accounts. He knew the schedules. He knew where Joseph lived. And perhaps most importantly, he knew when Joseph was alone. To investigators, this level of access mattered, because crimes like this rarely begin with forced entry. They begin with trust. As detectives dug deeper into financial records, a troubling pattern became impossible to ignore. Money was missing. Checks had been written without Joseph's authorization. Signatures appeared forged. Funds were transferred at odd times, often when Joseph was unavailable. Prosecutors would later argue that Merritt was under severe financial strain. He had debts. He was struggling financially, and Joseph was starting to notice. In the weeks leading up to February 2010, Joseph had confronted Merritt about the discrepancies. To investigators, this confrontation marked a critical turning point. Because once Joseph began asking questions, the clock started ticking. The prosecution's theory was chillingly straightforward. Joseph McStay was preparing to expose Merritt's financial misconduct. If that happened, Merritt stood to lose everything: his income, his reputation, and possibly his freedom. According to prosecutors, Merritt had motive, opportunity, and access. And when detectives examined what happened next, the timeline began pointing in his direction. Investigators turned to technology, specifically Merritt's cell phone records. What they found would become one of the most significant pieces of the case. On the night the McStay family disappeared, Merritt's phone showed activity consistent with being near the McStay home. Later, records indicated his phone traveled north, toward the Mojave Desert, near where the family's remains would eventually be discovered. Prosecutors argued this was no coincidence. They believed Merritt went to the McStay home under the guise of business, then transported the bodies to a remote desert location. The defense would later challenge the accuracy and interpretation of the phone data. But to investigators, the digital trail was deeply concerning. According to the prosecution, the sequence unfolded like this. Merritt lured Joseph to meet under the pretense of business. An argument escalated. Joseph was killed. Summer and the children, prosecutors argued, were then murdered to eliminate witnesses. It was a theory built on logic, not emotion, and it painted a grim picture of betrayal. However, investigators were careful. This was not a case with eyewitnesses. There was no confession, no direct video of the crime. What they had instead was a web of circumstantial evidence, each strand alone inconclusive, but together increasingly difficult to dismiss. From the beginning, Merritt's defense team pushed back hard. They argued that the case relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence. No murder weapon directly linked to Merritt. No blood found in his vehicle. No eyewitness placing him inside the McStay home at the time of the murders. They also questioned the reliability of cell phone location data, suggesting it could not pinpoint Merritt's exact movements. To the defense, suspicion did not equal guilt. But investigators weren't just looking at data. They were looking at behavior. In the days and weeks after the McStay family vanished, Merritt's actions drew quiet scrutiny. Financial activity continued. Forged checks appeared after Joseph was gone, and Merritt did not report the family missing, despite being one of the last people in contact with Joseph. To detectives, this raised red flags.
If a close business partner disappears with his entire family, why not ask questions? Why not alert authorities? Instead, Merritt remained silent.
By late 2014, investigators believed they had enough to act. Years of financial records, phone data, motive. The picture wasn't perfect, but it was compelling. And on November 5th, 2014, nearly 5 years after the McStay family disappeared, Charles Chase Merritt was arrested. He was charged with 4 counts of murder. For the first time, the case had a named suspect in custody. But the most difficult chapter was still ahead, because proving suspicion in court is very different from proving guilt. And the trial that followed would test every piece of evidence and every assumption in the McStay case.
What does justice look like when it arrives nearly a decade too late? After years of silence, suspicion, and unanswered questions, one man would finally be forced to answer for what prosecutors called a calculated betrayal, not just of a business partner, but of an entire family. And the courtroom would become the final battlefield. On November 5th, 2014, investigators made their move. Charles Chase Merritt, long suspected, quietly scrutinized, was arrested and charged with 4 counts of murder. For Joseph McStay's family, the arrest brought a mixture of relief and dread. Relief that the case was finally moving forward. Dread of what the coming years would demand, emotionally, publicly, and legally. The arrest did not bring instant closure. It marked the beginning of a long, complex legal fight. The case would not go to trial quickly. Pretrial motions, evidentiary hearings, and legal maneuvering stretched the timeline even further. Nearly 9 years had passed since the McStay family disappeared. Evidence was old, memories had faded, and every detail would now be dissected under a microscope. When the trial finally began in 2019, the stakes could not have been higher. The prosecution was seeking the ultimate penalty. Prosecutors presented a case built not on a single smoking gun, but on a pattern of financial deceit, a pattern of motive, and a digital trail that placed Merritt where he should not have been. They walked jurors through the forged checks, transactions made without Joseph's knowledge, some occurring even after the family vanished. They explained the growing confrontation between Joseph and Merritt over missing money. And then came the technology. Cell phone location data placed Merritt's phone near the McStay home on the night of the disappearance, and later near the desert burial site. Experts testified about blunt force trauma, the shallow graves, and the methodical nature of the killings. Prosecutors argued this was not an accident, not a robbery, but a deliberate act, driven by fear of exposure and financial collapse. The defense attacked every pillar of the prosecution's case. They argued the evidence was circumstantial, strong in theory, weak in certainty. Cell phone data, they said, could not pinpoint exact locations. Forged checks did not equal murder. And no eyewitness ever placed Merritt inside the McStay home during the critical hours. They emphasized what was missing: no confession, no direct physical evidence tying Merritt to the murders, no blood found in his vehicle. To the defense, suspicion had hardened into assumption. An assumption, they argued, was not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. After weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. For days, they reviewed financial records, phone logs, timelines, and expert analysis. Then, in June 2019, the verdict was read: guilty on all 4 counts of murder. For the McStay family's loved ones, the moment was overwhelming. After nearly a decade of waiting, the legal system had finally spoken. But the trial was not yet over. The sentencing phase was the most emotional chapter of the courtroom proceedings. Family members took the stand. They spoke about Joseph's ambitions, Summer's devotion, and the 2 young boys whose lives were cut short before they could begin. There were no do-overs, no second chances, no milestones left to reach. Prosecutors argued the crimes warranted the harshest punishment available under the law. The defense pleaded for mercy, but the jury was unmoved. In January 2020, Charles Chase Merritt was formally sentenced to death. It was the end of one legal journey and the beginning of another as appeals loomed on the horizon. Justice, at least in the eyes of the court, had been delivered. Yet, even with a verdict and a sentence, the case left behind lingering questions. Because courtrooms can decide guilt, but they cannot restore what was lost. The McStay family's names were finally spoken aloud in a verdict. Joseph, Summer, Johnny, Joseph Jr. Their story had moved from disappearance to discovery to conviction. But beyond the verdict, beyond the sentence, a deeper reckoning remained. How did so much time pass before the truth emerged? What signs were missed? And could this family have been found sooner? Those questions would linger long after the courtroom emptied, because even when justice is served, the echoes of a crime never truly fade.
When a verdict is read and a sentence is handed down, we often expect a case to feel finished. But what if justice answers the who, and still leaves us wondering how and why? Because even after the conviction of Charles Chase Merritt, the McStay family case refuses to fully settle into silence. Despite the guilty verdict, investigators, journalists, and the public continue to ask the same haunting questions. Why were there no obvious signs of violence inside the McStay home? No blood, no overturned furniture, no clear indication that a violent crime had taken place there. How did an entire family vanish without triggering immediate alarm? And how was one man able to overpower two adults and then transport the bodies without drawing attention? The answers are not simple. Investigators believe the crime may have unfolded quickly, possibly under the cover of trust, not force. A trusted person does not need to break down a door. They are already inside. Perhaps the most troubling question of all is this: could the McStay family have been found sooner? For years, the disappearance was treated as a possible voluntary departure, not a homicide. The border footage, the abandoned SUV, the lack of visible violence, all of it contributed to an assumption that delayed a deeper criminal investigation. Critics argue that if the case had been treated as a homicide from the beginning, evidence might have been preserved, leads pursued earlier, and answers uncovered faster. Supporters of law enforcement counter that without bodies or clear evidence, investigators were limited by the facts available at the time. Both things can be true, but the cost of delay was enormous. For nearly 4 years, the desert held the truth, hidden in shallow graves, far from the McStay home, far from the lives they once lived. It was chance, not investigation, that ultimately brought the family back into the light. And that reality has reshaped how missing family cases are viewed today. The McStay case is now frequently cited in criminal justice discussions as a reminder that disappearance does not always mean escape. Sometimes it means concealment. Lost in timelines, evidence charts, and courtroom arguments is the simplest truth of all, for lives were taken. Joseph McStay, a father building a future. Summer McStay, a mother devoted to her children. Johnny, just 4 years old. Joseph Jr., only 3. 2 boys who never reached school age, never had a first day of class, never learned who they would become. Their absence is not theoretical. It is permanent. This was not a crime of opportunity. It was not random. According to the court, it was a betrayal, carried out by someone close enough to be trusted and desperate enough to destroy everything in his path. The McStay case reminds us that the most dangerous threats are not always strangers. Sometimes they wear familiar faces. They share business meetings. They earn confidence. And when that trust is broken, the damage can be immeasurable. Legally, the case has reached a conclusion. Charles Chase Merritt was convicted and sentenced to death. But emotionally, for the families left behind, closure is not a courtroom decision. It is something that may never fully arrive. There are moments that cannot be answered by verdicts, and questions that echo long after the gavel falls. More than a decade later, the McStay family murders continue to resonate, because this case is not just about what happened in one home in Fallbrook. It's about how quickly assumptions can shape investigations, how silence can be mistaken for choice, and how easily ordinary lies can disappear without immediate explanation. The McStay case changed how missing family cases are evaluated, urging investigators to question early assumptions, even when evidence seems calm and ordinary. Because sometimes, the quietest scenes hide the darkest truths. Joseph, Summer, Johnny, Joseph Jr., a family erased, not by chance, but by betrayal. Their story is a reminder that truth does not vanish. It waits, sometimes for years, sometimes beneath the desert floor, but eventually it rises. In the end, the McStay family reminds us that the most dangerous threats are sometimes the ones we trust the most. And that truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of resurfacing. If you found this case compelling and want to follow more real investigations, courtroom moments, and true crime breakdowns, feel free to subscribe to the channel. Your likes, comments, and turning on the notification bell help you stay updated whenever we release a new story. Share your thoughts below. We'd love to hear your perspective.